The morning begins with a silence that feels unusually careful. Along the narrow streets leading toward the waterfront, windows are opened one after another, not because anything has happened yet, but because people have learned that the sea often delivers news before voices do. Curtains stir gently in the salt air. Somewhere beyond the rows of brick houses, gulls circle over the harbor with the same patient cries they have carried for generations, indifferent to the growing tension that has settled across the northern coast of France. The town still belongs to its ordinary rhythms, yet those rhythms have begun to hesitate, as though every familiar sound is quietly listening for another. Before you continue along these quiet streets, where every familiar corner is slowly learning the weight of uncertainty, take a moment to subscribe if you find peace in these forgotten histories. And if tonight's journey finds you somewhere far from the northern coast of France, let us know where you're listening from. Your quiet presence helps keep these stories alive. You're listening to Echoes of War. From an upstairs window, a woman pauses while folding freshly dried linen, her hands remaining still for a moment longer than necessary as she notices another column of vehicles moving along the distant road. They are not the first to pass, nor will they be the last, but each convoy seems larger than the one before. Dust follows behind the trucks until it mingles with the pale morning haze, softening their outlines into something almost dreamlike. No official announcement accompanies their arrival. No single moment declares that life has entered a different chapter. Change comes instead through accumulation, one unfamiliar sight settling gently beside another until the landscape itself begins to feel slightly altered. You find yourself watching not for explosions or sudden violence, but for these smaller shifts that often escape history's larger memory. A baker leaves fewer loaves outside his shop than he usually would. Fishermen return earlier than expected, speaking more quietly while they secure their boats against the harbor wall. Schoolchildren still chase one another across the square, although their games are interrupted more often by adults calling them back indoors. The town continues to function, yet every routine now carries an invisible question that no one can answer with certainty. Far beyond the dunes, across fields where spring grasses bend beneath a steady wind, distant artillery rolls so softly that it could almost be mistaken for approaching thunder. Those who have lived near the coast all their lives understand the difference immediately. Storms move with the weather. This sound remains fixed upon the horizon, returning again and again throughout the day like the slow beating of a heart too far away to see. People stop what they are doing when it arrives, not because they expect danger that very moment, but because they understand that distance has become an unreliable comfort. The front is no longer an idea traced across newspapers. It has acquired a voice carried through the air itself. The harbor continues its patient labor despite these reminders. Ropes creak gently against wooden posts polished smooth by decades of tides. Small fishing vessels rock upon the water with restrained movements, their reflections trembling beneath a sky that remains almost painfully peaceful. Dock workers unload crates, mend nets, and exchange familiar greetings, preserving habits built through years of repetition. Yet even here, where the sea has always governed the pace of life more than politics ever could, conversations have shortened. Eyes wander more frequently toward the roads leading inland. Every arrival invites speculation. Every departure leaves another silence behind. The town has not yet become the Dunkirk remembered in books and photographs. It remains simply a place where families prepare meals, where children lose track of time while collecting shells along the beach, and where old men sit outside cafes discussing tides, weather, and fishing seasons. History has not fully entered these streets. It waits just beyond them, approaching with deliberate patience, allowing ordinary life one final opportunity to believe that tomorrow might resemble yesterday. As evening settles over the rooftops, the changing light conceals little and reveals much. Shadows lengthen across the harbor stones while the sea gathers the last traces of daylight into long ribbons of silver that stretch toward the horizon. Lamps begin to appear behind windows, one by one, each small glow suggesting that supper is being prepared, children are being called inside, and another ordinary day is reaching its familiar conclusion. Yet familiarity itself has become fragile. Conversations linger longer at doorways. Neighbors ask questions whose answers no one possesses. The same rumors circulate through kitchens, market stalls, and church steps, growing neither clearer nor quieter as they pass from one voice to another. The roads leading into the town now carry more than local traffic. Civilian families arrive with carts piled high with blankets, cages holding restless chickens, bicycles burdened with impossible amounts of luggage, and suitcases chosen hurriedly from wardrobes that may never be opened again. Their clothing is dusted with the pale earth of villages already left behind, and their faces carry the peculiar exhaustion that belongs not to physical labor alone, but to uncertainty prolonged over many days. Some pause only long enough to drink water before continuing toward the coast. Others remain, believing that perhaps the sea will offer safety where the land no longer can. Those already living in Dunkirk watch these arrivals with quiet compassion, though beneath every act of kindness rests an unspoken realization that tomorrow they themselves may become travelers without destinations. Inside the town hall, official study maps spread across heavy wooden tables beneath electric lights that seem too calm for the decisions being discussed. Telegraph messages arrive with increasing frequency. Telephone receivers are lifted and replaced so often that the familiar gestures become mechanical. Information flows continuously, yet certainty becomes increasingly scarce. Reports contradict one another. Distances shrink more quickly than expected. The machinery of administration continues to operate, but its confidence begins to erode almost invisibly. Institutions, much like people, rarely collapse in a single dramatic instant. More often they simply discover that each new morning demands answers they no longer possess. You begin to notice another change that no proclamation ever announces. The town has started listening differently. Every engine heard beyond the rooftops draws eyes toward the sky. Every unfamiliar knock upon a door briefly interrupts conversation. Even silence acquires new meaning, because silence may indicate safety, or absence, or merely the moment before another piece of uncertain news arrives. Listening itself becomes part of daily routine, as natural as preparing breakfast or sweeping the front step. Entire communities begin measuring time not only by clocks, but by sounds carried upon the wind. Along the beaches, the tide continues its ancient rhythm without concern for armies or governments. Waves arrive with measured patience, smoothing footprints left by fishermen, children, and wandering dogs alike. The sea offers no prediction of what it will soon witness. It simply breathes against the sand, retreating and returning beneath a sky whose quiet beauty feels almost unsettling. Nature does not deny the coming turmoil. It merely continues alongside it, preserving a rhythm far older than any conflict unfolding upon the continent. In the days ahead, these beaches will become known across the world. Their names will enter history through military reports, memoirs, photographs, and remembrance ceremonies. Yet before they belong to history, they belong to ordinary people who crossed them on their way to work, who gathered shells after storms, who watched fishing boats return at dusk, and who measured the seasons by tides rather than by campaigns. Their story begins before rescue. It begins before legend. It begins with waiting. The town before departure. Morning arrives through a thin veil of sea mist that softens the edges of every rooftop and chimney along the harbor. From a distance, Dunkirk seems unchanged, as though the town has simply awakened to another cool spring day shaped by tides and fishing schedules rather than armies and front lines. Church bells travel easily through the damp air, their familiar rhythm drifting across narrow streets before dissolving above the water. Shopkeepers lift wooden shutters from their windows, sweeping yesterday's dust from their thresholds with movements practiced so often that they scarcely require thought. The harbor breathes quietly beside them, carrying the mixed scents of salt, damp rope, coal smoke, and fresh bread from nearby bakeries, each fragrance belonging to a world that still believes routine possesses the strength to continue indefinitely. The port has always lived according to patterns that seem older than memory itself. Fishing boats leave before sunrise while the sea remains grey and almost perfectly still, their engines disturbing only the quiet surface beneath flocks of gulls already searching for breakfast. Dock workers know which planks creak beneath heavy loads and which bollards have weathered enough winters to require careful handling. Warehouse doors swing open with familiar groans. Carts roll steadily across worn cobblestones polished smooth by generations of labor. None of these actions appears remarkable because repetition has transformed them into something almost invisible. Yet it is precisely these unnoticed routines that give a town its deepest sense of permanence. Children weave effortlessly through this carefully ordered world, carrying schoolbooks beneath their arms while pausing whenever something more interesting appears along the roadside. A stray cat sleeping in a patch of sunlight deserves careful investigation. So does a fisherman repairing torn nets beside the quay, his rough hands moving with patient precision learned through decades spent reading tides rather than clocks. The children ask questions that adults answer almost automatically, explaining knots, boats, birds, and weather with the easy confidence that comes from believing tomorrow will provide another opportunity for the lesson to continue. Childhood possesses its own remarkable resistance to uncertainty, accepting each ordinary morning as though no alternative has ever existed. Inside modest brick houses overlooking the streets, breakfast unfolds according to habits established long before anyone imagined another European war would return to these shores. Water boils upon cast-iron stoves. Coffee, where it can still be obtained, is measured carefully rather than generously. Bread is sliced evenly so that every member of the household receives an equal portion. Mothers straighten collars before children leave for school, while fathers discuss work awaiting them at the docks, workshops, or nearby rail yards. Newspapers lie folded upon kitchen tables, carrying headlines that speak of military advances far beyond the immediate horizon. Yet many readers linger longer over local notices, weather forecasts, and shipping reports than over battlefield maps. The distant conflict feels undeniably real, but daily obligations continue demanding attention with quiet persistence. You notice how ordinary objects begin carrying unexpected importance when uncertainty approaches slowly rather than suddenly. A polished teacup placed carefully back inside its cupboard. Boots drying beside the back door after yesterday's rain. Laundry fluttering gently between neighboring houses where conversations drift easily across shared courtyards. These things rarely attract attention during peaceful years because they appear permanent by nature. Only when change begins gathering beyond the edges of everyday life do people recognize how deeply comfort depends upon countless small rituals performed without conscious reflection. The railway station provides another measure of the town's changing pulse. Trains still arrive according to schedules printed weeks earlier, yet the passengers stepping onto the platform increasingly carry more luggage than local travel usually requires. Some glance repeatedly toward notice boards before quietly asking station staff whether additional services will be running later in the week. Others speak in accents unfamiliar to the town, having traveled from communities farther inland where the movement of armies has become less theoretical than it remains here. Station masters answer politely whenever they can, though certainty has become difficult to offer. Timetables remain posted, but the future they promise has begun to loosen from reality. Throughout the market square, familiar faces continue greeting one another with the restrained warmth characteristic of people who have shared the same streets for many years. Vegetable sellers arrange neat rows of carrots, onions, and cabbages beneath canvas awnings that ripple softly whenever the coastal breeze strengthens. Butchers sharpen knives before opening their doors. Flower stalls still display bunches of spring blossoms whose colors seem almost startling against the muted brick and stone surrounding them. Customers discuss prices, harvests, and relatives, though conversations increasingly pause whenever someone mentions troop movements or rumors carried by travelers arriving from the south. No one wishes to appear frightened, yet neither can anyone entirely ignore the growing sense that the familiar boundaries separating ordinary life from extraordinary events have begun to thin. The sea, meanwhile, continues offering its own quiet lesson in patience. Waves advance and withdraw with measured regularity, erasing footprints almost as quickly as they appear upon the damp sand. Fishing boats return with modest catches that are unloaded carefully into waiting carts before being carried toward market. From the shoreline, the horizon remains impossibly wide, concealing more than it reveals. It has always been this way. Sailors understand that distance often hides both opportunity and danger until the moment either finally arrives within sight. Now an entire town begins sharing that same uneasy understanding, watching an empty horizon that feels increasingly full of possibilities no one truly wishes to imagine. As the days continue, the town begins to notice not one dramatic alteration but dozens of almost imperceptible ones. They arrive quietly enough that no single change seems worthy of remark on its own, yet together they begin reshaping the character of familiar places. Military vehicles become more common along roads once occupied mainly by delivery wagons and bicycles. Soldiers appear in cafes at hours when fishermen would normally fill the tables. Maps are unfolded more frequently than newspapers, and conversations pause whenever someone in uniform enters the room, not out of fear, but because the presence of soldiers gently reminds everyone that events unfolding elsewhere are moving steadily closer. The harbor itself becomes a meeting place for two very different worlds. Along one quay, fishermen continue repairing weathered nets with the calm concentration inherited from generations before them. A few dozen steps away, military lorries arrive carrying crates whose markings reveal little beyond urgency. Men accustomed to loading barrels of herring now find themselves helping unload fuel drums, medical supplies, and ammunition. The physical labor feels familiar, but its purpose has changed. Ordinary hands continue performing ordinary movements, while the meaning behind those movements quietly transforms. Work remains work, yet every completed task now belongs to something far larger than the town itself. Women waiting outside bakeries begin arriving earlier each morning. At first, the reason is practical. Flour has become less predictable, and popular items sell more quickly than before. Soon, however, these early queues serve another purpose. They become places where information is exchanged with cautious voices and careful expressions. One customer has heard that refugees have crossed another nearby district. Another mentions columns of British soldiers moving northward through villages only a day's journey away. Someone else insists the reports are exaggerated. Rumor settles into daily life much like the sea mist drifting through the streets, impossible to grasp completely yet present almost everywhere. You observe how uncertainty changes people's relationship with time. Clocks continue marking the hours exactly as they always have, but the future beyond tomorrow begins losing its familiar shape. Appointments are made more cautiously. Small household repairs that might once have been postponed are completed immediately. Letters are written sooner rather than later. Parents spend a little longer watching children play before calling them home for supper, perhaps without fully understanding why they hesitate before closing the front door. Nothing outwardly dramatic has occurred, yet ordinary moments begin carrying the quiet weight usually reserved for farewells. Inside workshops scattered throughout the town, craftsmen continue shaping wood, repairing engines, and mending tools that local families still require. The rhythm of hammer against metal remains reassuringly steady, echoing through open doorways into the surrounding streets. Yet deliveries become less dependable, replacement parts harder to obtain, and familiar suppliers increasingly difficult to reach. Every trade begins adjusting in small ways. Carpenters save scraps of timber they might previously have discarded. Blacksmiths repair worn implements instead of recommending replacements. Tailors patch old garments with greater care, understanding that new fabric may soon become a luxury rather than an expectation. Adaptation begins long before necessity openly demands it. Along the beaches, spring continues unfolding with remarkable indifference to human anxiety. The dunes sway beneath persistent coastal winds, their grasses bending together before rising again. Children still gather shells and smooth stones while dogs chase one another across the damp sand left behind by the retreating tide. Their laughter carries easily across the open shoreline, momentarily overwhelming the distant murmur of artillery that sometimes drifts across the water when the wind turns inland. Adults watching from farther up the beach allow these moments to continue uninterrupted. They understand, perhaps instinctively, that childhood should be permitted every remaining fragment of ordinary happiness before history claims more of the landscape. Evening returns with the gentle certainty that only nature can still provide. Smoke rises from chimneys into a sky slowly deepening from pale blue to soft violet, while the first stars appear above the quiet harbor. Lamps glow warmly behind curtained windows, and from outside it would be easy to imagine that little has changed within the town. Yet beneath those familiar lights, maps remain folded beside dinner plates, newspapers are read more carefully than before, and conversations often end not because everything has been said, but because no one can say with confidence what tomorrow will bring. Dunkirk still belongs to its people, still follows the rhythm of tides and seasons, but beneath that enduring surface another rhythm has begun to emerge, slower than panic yet stronger than habit, drawing the town almost imperceptibly toward a future from which there will be no simple return. Roads of arrival. The roads leading toward Dunkirk possess their own quiet memory. Long before they carried soldiers, they welcomed fishermen returning from inland markets, farmers bringing early harvests toward the coast, and families visiting relatives in neighboring villages. Their gentle curves follow old boundaries shaped by fields, canals, and scattered rows of poplar trees that lean slightly beneath the prevailing winds. During peaceful years, these roads ask little of those who travel them beyond patience and sturdy wheels. They measure distance not in urgency, but in familiar landmarks passed season after season. Now those same roads begin carrying people whose journeys are no longer planned around market days or family visits. They arrive gradually enough that no single morning appears remarkable. A bicycle loaded with more blankets than luggage passes through the town before breakfast. By midday, a horse cart rolls carefully over the cobblestones beneath the weight of hastily packed furniture tied together with lengths of rope. Toward evening, another family appears on foot, children walking silently beside parents whose attention rarely leaves the road behind them. None of these arrivals creates alarm on its own. Together, however, they begin altering the rhythm of the town more profoundly than any official announcement could. Those who have traveled from farther south carry the landscape with them. Mud clings to boots that have crossed fields instead of roads. Fine dust settles into the folds of jackets worn through many uninterrupted days outdoors. Faces reveal neither theatrical fear nor visible panic, but something quieter and perhaps more enduring. Many have discovered that uncertainty itself can become exhausting. Decisions repeated hour after hour, whether to stop, whether to continue, whether another road might prove safer than the last, gradually replace the simple confidence with which ordinary journeys are usually undertaken. Even after reaching Dunkirk, many continue glancing over their shoulders, as though movement itself has become difficult to abandon. The residents who welcome them do so with restrained generosity born from ordinary decency rather than organized relief. A pitcher of water appears outside a doorway before anyone asks for it. Bread is divided into smaller portions than usual so that unexpected guests may also eat. Barns, workshops, and spare rooms accommodate travelers for a night or two whenever space allows. These gestures are rarely spoken about afterward because they belong to the quiet customs of communities accustomed to helping neighbors through storms, illness, and difficult harvests. Yet each act now carries a subtle awareness that generosity itself may soon become harder to sustain if the stream of arrivals continues to grow. You begin to notice that every newcomer brings not only another pair of hands or another mouth to feed, but another version of the war itself. One family speaks of bridges crowded beyond recognition. Another remembers sleeping in orchards after darkness made further travel impossible. Someone else recalls villages where church bells had stopped ringing because there was no longer anyone willing to risk climbing the tower. None of these accounts tells the entire story. They overlap imperfectly, occasionally contradicting one another, yet together they form something resembling the outline of a landscape steadily changing beyond the horizon. Dunkirk learns about the advancing war not through official communiques alone, but through weary voices carrying fragments of lived experience. The railway station becomes increasingly crowded without ever quite descending into disorder. Porters continue moving luggage carts along the platforms with practiced efficiency, though the baggage now consists less of holiday cases and more of hastily gathered possessions wrapped in blankets or tied together with string. Children clutch wooden toys, family photographs, or cages containing nervous birds whose songs have become strangely subdued after days of travel. Elderly passengers sit quietly upon benches while younger relatives search for information that station staff struggle to provide with confidence. Trains still arrive and depart, yet every timetable seems more provisional than the one printed beside it. Beyond the station, cafes continue serving coffee where supplies permit, and bowls of warm soup remain available to those fortunate enough to find a seat. Their familiar interiors, filled with polished wooden tables and walls darkened by decades of tobacco smoke, have always offered shelter from coastal winds. Now they provide another kind of refuge. Travelers warm cold hands around chipped ceramic cups while listening carefully to conversations unfolding at neighboring tables. Local residents study unfamiliar faces without intrusion, attempting to understand how far away the war truly remains. Outside, bicycles lean against stone walls exactly as they always have, but inside, the distance between ordinary life and extraordinary events narrows with every quiet exchange. Meanwhile, the fields surrounding Dunkirk continue responding only to the season. Fresh green shoots emerge where farmers have recently turned the soil. Small streams reflect passing clouds with complete indifference to the growing procession of humanity moving along nearby roads. Birds settle into hedgerows at dusk, filling the cooling air with songs unchanged from countless previous springs. Nature offers neither reassurance nor warning. It simply continues its patient work, providing a steady rhythm against which the increasingly uncertain movement of people becomes all the more visible. The contrast grows stronger with each passing day, reminding those who watch that the land itself remains familiar even as the lives unfolding upon it begin to change beyond recognition. As the flow of newcomers continues, the town gradually develops a new kind of geography. Streets that were once known simply for their shops, workshops, or family homes begin acquiring quieter meanings understood only by those who now depend upon them. One corner is known for a well where fresh water may always be drawn. Another becomes recognized for a widow who never refuses to offer a bowl of soup, even when her own pantry has grown noticeably smaller. A warehouse near the docks provides shelter from unexpected rain, while the broad stone steps outside the church allow weary travelers a place to rest without obstructing the movement of others. None of these places appears extraordinary to someone passing through quickly, yet together they form an informal network of kindness that grows naturally from the habits of ordinary people responding to unfamiliar circumstances. The market square reflects these subtle changes with remarkable clarity. Merchants continue arranging vegetables, bread, fish, and household goods much as they always have, but customers now linger longer between the stalls. Purchases become secondary to conversation. People compare the condition of roads, discuss villages farther inland, and quietly exchange observations gathered from relatives or passing soldiers. News no longer travels primarily through newspapers or official notices. Instead, it moves at the pace of footsteps, carried by individuals who have seen one bridge, one crossroads, or one distant church tower before continuing north. Every account adds another small piece to an incomplete picture that no single resident can fully assemble. Children remain among the most careful observers of these changes, even if they understand them differently from their parents. They notice the unfamiliar accents spoken by visiting families and the unusual markings painted upon military vehicles parked near the harbor. They watch horses pulling heavily loaded wagons whose wheels leave deeper impressions in the soft roadside earth than local carts usually do. They ask why so many people seem to be traveling in the same direction, and why some adults stop speaking whenever those questions are asked. Answers are often gentle but incomplete, shaped less by certainty than by the hope that tomorrow may still provide reassurance. Childhood continues adapting with quiet resilience, accepting partial explanations because the world has not yet taught it to demand complete ones. Inside family homes, evenings begin stretching slightly later than before. Lamps remain lit while maps are unfolded across dining tables, though few households possess anything more detailed than regional road atlases or aging schoolroom maps pinned to walls years earlier. Fathers trace routes with calloused fingers while mothers mentally calculate how much flour, coal, soap, or preserved food remains available if ordinary deliveries should become interrupted. These discussions rarely produce firm decisions. Instead, they create a growing awareness that preparation itself has become another daily responsibility, joining cooking, cleaning, and work as part of ordinary domestic life. You notice how waiting quietly changes the meaning of familiar sounds. The whistle of a distant train no longer signifies only arrivals and departures. It suggests possibilities that cannot yet be measured. The steady hum of engines beyond the town raises questions before anyone identifies the vehicles producing them. Even the ringing of bicycle bells along narrow streets briefly draws attention before daily habit gently reasserts itself. Listening has become more deliberate. The ears begin searching the landscape almost before the eyes do, discovering that uncertainty often announces itself through subtle changes in sound long before anything becomes visible. Along the canals threading their way toward the sea, barges continue moving at their unhurried pace, their reflections drifting lazily across dark water disturbed only by the occasional ripple from passing ducks. Locks still open and close according to the patient mechanics perfected over generations. Lock keepers continue recording movements with neat handwriting in worn ledgers, whose pages have chronicled peaceful commerce for decades. Yet even here, the cargo begins changing. Agricultural produce increasingly shares space with military supplies. Civilian travelers occasionally request passage where once only merchants would have appeared. The canals themselves remain unchanged, but the lives depending upon them gradually acquire a different purpose. As daylight fades, the roads leading south do not grow empty. Instead, scattered silhouettes continue appearing against the dimming horizon long after most families have gathered indoors for the evening meal. Some travelers walk only until darkness becomes too complete to continue safely. Others choose to press onward beneath moonlight, believing that every additional mile may place them farther from dangers they cannot precisely describe. Residents watching from upstairs windows sometimes leave a small lantern burning a little longer than necessary, offering light to strangers who will never know the thought behind the gesture. These acts are almost invisible within the vast movement of history, yet they become part of the quiet fabric holding a community together as uncertainty deepens. By the time another dawn approaches, Dunkirk has not become a city overwhelmed by chaos. It remains orderly, disciplined, and outwardly composed. But beneath that calm surface, its role has begun to change. It is no longer simply a destination at the edge of the sea. It is becoming a place where countless separate journeys briefly intersect, where ordinary residents and weary travelers share the same streets while carrying very different understandings of what lies just beyond the horizon. The town continues to wait, though the waiting itself has grown heavier, enriched by every story that arrives before the war itself does. Along the harbour walls. The harbour has always possessed its own language, spoken not through words but through movement. Water rises and falls against stone walls darkened by centuries of tides. Mooring ropes tighten and relax with the slow breathing of the sea. Wooden hulls answer each gentle swell with quiet creaks that regular visitors scarcely notice anymore. Even before sunrise, long before the first church bell marks the beginning of another day, the port has already awakened. It is a place where labor begins with the light, where weather is read from clouds and wind rather than forecasts, and where familiarity with the sea has shaped generations into patient observers of things that cannot be hurried. For many families, the harbor is less a workplace than an extension of home itself. Children grow up recognizing vessels by their silhouettes long before they learn to read their names painted across the sterns. Elderly men can recall storms from decades earlier simply by standing at a particular section of the quay where waves once climbed over the stone in remarkable winter tides. Women carrying baskets toward the morning market know precisely when the fishing boats usually return and which captains are likely to have the freshest catch. The waterfront is not merely a location upon a map. It is woven into memory so completely that every corner carries echoes of countless ordinary days. Now those same quays begin accommodating unfamiliar rhythms without abandoning the old ones entirely. Naval personnel appear more frequently among the fishermen, studying charts beneath folded coats that flap gently in the sea breeze. Military trucks arrive before dawn, reversing carefully toward warehouses where crates are unloaded with quiet efficiency. Dock workers continue lifting cargo exactly as they always have, yet the labels upon the boxes have changed. Ammunition replaces imported goods. Fuel drums occupy spaces where barrels of fish oil or sacks of grain once stood. The harbor performs the same physical tasks while slowly serving a different purpose. There is remarkably little visible urgency at first. Orders are spoken in measured voices rather than shouted. Officers pause to observe tides before making decisions, understanding that the sea cannot be persuaded to follow military schedules. Sailors secure ropes with the same practiced knots they have tied 1,000 times before. Routine persists because routine remains the safest companion whenever uncertainty begins pressing upon every decision. People who work beside the water understand instinctively that panic rarely improves difficult conditions. Patience, careful preparation, and respect for forces larger than oneself have always been the true disciplines of maritime life. You watch as ordinary residents gradually begin adjusting their own daily paths through the harbor district. Some choose slightly different streets to avoid military traffic. Others linger along the seawall longer than usual, quietly observing ships whose destinations remain unknown. Shopkeepers pause outside their doors whenever another convoy passes, waiting until the engines fade into the distance before returning to their work. These are not dramatic interruptions. They are small adjustments repeated often enough that they become new habits before anyone consciously recognizes them as such. The cafes overlooking the waterfront continue filling each morning, though their conversations have become noticeably quieter. Fishermen still discuss tides and weather, but military movements now enter those same conversations with increasing regularity. Someone remarks that another destroyer departed during the night. Another recalls seeing transport vessels farther offshore than usual. A retired sailor, who has spent most of his life reading coastlines and currents, studies the horizon through weathered eyes before quietly admitting that there are simply more ships than there were a month ago. No one attempts to explain precisely what this means. Observation remains more reliable than speculation. Along the breakwater, gulls continue their endless patrols above the waves, diving occasionally towards scraps floating near the piers before rising effortlessly into the coastal wind. They are entirely unconcerned by uniforms, trucks, or changing cargo. Their presence reminds the harbor that nature seldom acknowledges the distinctions human beings consider so important. The tide arrives exactly when it should. The wind shifts with familiar predictability. Clouds gather and disperse according to invisible currents stretching far beyond the channel. Against this enduring rhythm, the growing military presence appears strangely temporary, as though the harbor itself understands that wars pass through places that remain long after armies have departed. Yet permanence can sometimes conceal profound change. A warehouse that yesterday stored fishing equipment now holds medical supplies. A pier once reserved for commercial vessels quietly receives naval craft before first light. Families strolling along the waterfront begin stopping a little farther back than they once did, respecting spaces that have subtly ceased to belong entirely to civilian life. Nothing has been taken from them through proclamation or ceremony. Instead, the harbor slowly rearranges itself around new priorities, preserving its familiar appearance while gently altering the invisible rules governing who may stand where, who may enter which buildings, and who now waits behind newly erected barriers. The transformation advances so gradually that many residents notice it only after discovering they have already begun accepting it as ordinary. As one morning follows another, the harbor begins measuring time less by the return of fishing boats than by the arrival and departure of military vessels whose schedules are known only to a handful of officers. Some appear before dawn, their silhouettes emerging quietly through the mist until they seem almost to grow from the sea itself. Others leave long after darkness has settled across the waterfront, their navigation lights becoming small, wavering stars upon the channel before disappearing completely. Residents living near the docks grow accustomed to hearing engines at unusual hours, though familiarity never quite removes the curiosity that accompanies each movement upon the water. The warehouses lining the quays remain outwardly unchanged, their brick walls still bearing the marks of salt, rain, and decades of hard labor. Inside, however, their character begins shifting in subtle ways. Wooden crates stamped with unfamiliar military markings are stacked beside bales of rope and fishing equipment that have not yet found another home. Medical supplies share space with ordinary cargo. Maps are spread across rough timber tables where merchants once counted invoices and shipping manifests. The buildings themselves continue serving the harbor, yet the definition of service has quietly expanded beyond commerce into preparation for something no one can fully describe. Dock workers adapt with the practical calm that years of physical labor often encourage. Heavy loads remain heavy regardless of what they contain, and careful lifting prevents injury whether one is moving sacks of flour or boxes of ammunition. Many have spent their entire working lives responding to changing cargoes, changing tides, and changing markets. Flexibility has always been part of the profession. Still, they begin noticing that certain questions are no longer answered as openly as before. Destinations remain unspecified. Deliveries arrive without the usual paperwork being discussed aloud. Areas that once welcomed familiar faces are now watched by military sentries, whose duties require politeness without conversation. You observe how the harbor slowly acquires new boundaries that are almost invisible until someone unknowingly crosses them. A rope stretched across part of a quay quietly redirects pedestrians toward another route. A wooden sign requests that civilians remain beyond a particular gate. Soldiers posted at entrances speak courteously but firmly, apologizing as they ask local residents to choose another path home. These changes appear minor when viewed individually. Together, they alter the experience of moving through places that generations had previously considered entirely public. Familiar ground becomes slightly unfamiliar, not because its appearance has changed dramatically, but because permission has become part of everyday movement. Along the seawall, older residents continue their habitual walks despite these quiet adjustments. They stop where they have always stopped, resting hands upon smooth stone worn by countless tides while watching the channel stretch toward England beneath shifting skies. Many have witnessed difficult winters, destructive storms, and years when poor fishing catches tested the resilience of the town. Experience has taught them that coastlines are places of continual change. Yet this transformation feels different. Storms eventually pass. Markets recover. Boats are repaired. The alterations unfolding around the harbor seem less connected to nature than to decisions being made far beyond the horizon, by people the town will never meet. Children, meanwhile, continue discovering wonder where adults increasingly perceive caution. They count the ships anchored offshore, trying to remember whether there are more than yesterday. They imitate sailors tying imaginary knots with pieces of discarded rope found near the docks. They collect smooth pebbles beside the breakwater while occasionally glancing toward uniforms that have become almost as familiar as the fishermen themselves. The adults watching over them allow these games to continue, though they instinctively keep the children a little closer than they once did. Care begins expressing itself through distance measured in only a few extra steps. As afternoon light softens across the water, the harbor settles briefly into a rhythm that resembles its older self. Fishing vessels return with modest catches. Market carts wait patiently beside the quays. The cries of gulls once again become the loudest sound carried by the wind. For an hour or two, it becomes possible to imagine that the military activity belongs merely to the edges of the port rather than its center. Then another convoy arrives, engines echoing between the warehouses, and the illusion gently dissolves. No dramatic interruption occurs. Instead, the harbor simply resumes its gradual transformation, continuing to perform the work it has always known while quietly preparing for responsibilities it has never before been asked to bear. When evening finally settles over the waterfront, reflections from harbor lamps shimmer across dark water disturbed only by the tide. The sea accepts every image without judgment, blending fishing boats, naval craft, warehouses, and church towers into a single wavering picture that shifts with each passing ripple. From a distance, Dunkirk still appears peaceful. The lights remain warm, the streets orderly, and the harbor faithful to its ancient rhythm. Yet beneath that reassuring surface, another current has begun flowing, one carrying the town steadily toward the moment when waiting will give way to abandonment, and ordinary routines will be asked to endure far more than anyone standing along the harbor wall can yet imagine. Houses that remained open. The first houses to welcome strangers do not announce themselves in any visible way. Their doors remain the same weathered wood they have always been, their gardens no larger than before, their windows looking onto the same narrow streets where bicycles continue to pass and neighbors still exchange quiet greetings. Nothing distinguishes them from the hundreds of other homes lining Dunkirk's neighborhoods. The difference exists only for those who knock with uncertainty rather than familiarity, hoping that someone inside might still have room for one more person, if only for a single night. Hospitality in a coastal town has long been shaped by necessity rather than ceremony. Storms have always stranded travelers. Fishing crews have occasionally returned with unexpected guests rescued from damaged boats. Merchants delayed by weather have slept in spare rooms above kitchens while waiting for roads to dry or tides to change. Offering shelter has never been regarded as extraordinary. It belongs to the same unwritten customs as sharing bread with a neighbor whose harvest has failed or helping repair a roof damaged by winter winds. What changes now is not the instinct itself, but the scale upon which that instinct is quietly tested. Inside one modest brick house overlooking a side street, a family clears the dining table earlier than usual. Plates are washed, benches shifted, and blankets carried down from an upstairs cupboard where they have rested since the previous winter. No one knows whether anyone will actually arrive before darkness falls, yet preparation itself has become another routine. The youngest child watches with curiosity while asking whether relatives are coming to visit. The answer offered is gentle and truthful without explaining everything. Guests may come. They have traveled a long way. They are tired. That is enough for now. Elsewhere, another household rearranges sleeping places with practical efficiency. Parents quietly agree that children can share one bed for a few nights if necessary. A grandfather insists upon giving up his own room without waiting to be asked, claiming with a smile that his old chair beside the stove has always been more comfortable than any mattress. The remark draws soft laughter around the room, though everyone understands it conceals a deliberate kindness. Small sacrifices become easier when they are disguised as ordinary preferences. Pride remains intact, generosity preserved, and no one is made to feel like a burden. You begin to notice that homes possess their own rhythms of adaptation, just as streets and harbors do. Meals stretch slightly farther through careful portions rather than larger supplies. Water is heated a little more often because more hands require washing after long journeys. Laundry appears on clotheslines with greater frequency, fluttering gently above courtyards where unfamiliar garments now hang beside those belonging to local families. These quiet domestic changes reveal no spectacle. They speak instead of accommodation, patience, and the remarkable flexibility hidden within ordinary households long before anyone thinks to describe them as resilient. The kitchens become places where stories are exchanged almost accidentally. While soup simmers over steady flames and bread is sliced into equal pieces, travelers describe villages left behind not as dramatic scenes but as collections of familiar details. A bakery whose shutters never opened one morning. A bridge crowded beyond anything anyone had previously imagined possible. Fields where abandoned carts still stood because there had been no horses left to pull them farther. These memories emerge slowly, interrupted by long pauses as though each speaker must first decide which observations deserve carrying forward and which are better left behind with the roads already traveled. Some evenings pass with very little conversation at all. Exhaustion often proves stronger than curiosity. Guests eat quietly, thank their hosts with restrained sincerity, and fall asleep almost immediately after blankets are unfolded across kitchen floors or spare rooms prepared for their arrival. The silence inside these homes is neither uncomfortable nor empty. It carries the shared understanding that rest itself has become valuable. Outside, church bells continue marking the hours exactly as they always have, while the sea breeze slips through slightly opened windows carrying the familiar scent of salt into rooms that now shelter lives briefly brought together by circumstances none of them had chosen. The neighborhoods surrounding these houses continue appearing remarkably unchanged to anyone walking past during daylight. Children still play beneath rows of chestnut trees. Shopkeepers sweep their doorsteps before opening for business. Laundry continues drying between neighboring buildings whenever sunshine permits. Yet behind many of those front doors, the definition of family has quietly expanded. Not permanently, and not formally, but enough that ordinary households begin accommodating unfamiliar voices at the breakfast table and unfamiliar footsteps climbing staircases late in the evening. The town itself has not grown larger, but the homes within it have begun carrying more of the world's uncertainty than they were ever designed to hold. Morning begins differently inside these homes once additional people have become part of their temporary rhythm. The first person awake no longer moves through familiar rooms alone. Someone folds borrowed blankets before anyone else has entered the kitchen. Another quietly opens a window, allowing the cool air from the channel to replace the warmth gathered overnight. Coffee, where it is still available, is measured with greater care than before. Bread is divided into thinner slices, not because generosity has diminished, but because generosity now includes more hands reaching toward the same table. No one remarks upon the smaller portions. Courtesy quietly replaces abundance. The children adapt with a speed that surprises many of the adults. They quickly learn new names, though they often pronounce them differently at first. Games resume almost naturally in courtyards and narrow streets, despite the fact that yesterday these companions had been complete strangers. A wooden spinning top requires no shared language. Neither does a game played with chalk upon worn paving stones or the careful construction of small boats floated in roadside puddles after spring rain. Watching them together, it becomes briefly possible to believe that childhood possesses its own quiet diplomacy, one capable of ignoring distinctions that seem impossible for the grown world to overcome. The adults, meanwhile, carry conversations that unfold more slowly. They compare ordinary routines before speaking about extraordinary circumstances. Which bakery produces the best bread when flour is plentiful? Which fishing grounds usually provide the most reliable catch in early summer? Which church bell can still be heard from the farthest fields outside town? Only after these familiar subjects have established a shared humanity do discussions gradually turn toward the roads traveled, the villages abandoned, and the uncertain future stretching ahead. Practical details provide a gentler bridge than direct questions ever could. They remind everyone seated around the table that before becoming refugees or hosts, they had all simply belonged to places shaped by ordinary work and ordinary seasons. You notice that kindness often expresses itself through habits so familiar they almost disappear from attention. A chair is quietly placed closer to the stove before an elderly guest enters the room. A child is gently encouraged to finish only half of an apple so the remaining slices may be shared without making the gesture seem deliberate. A jacket left drying beside the fire is carefully turned so that its damp lining faces the warmth before its owner wakes. None of these actions receives thanks because they are rarely acknowledged aloud. They belong to the silent vocabulary of care, spoken fluently by people who understand that dignity is easiest to preserve when generosity remains almost invisible. Outside the houses, neighborhood life continues balancing continuity with gradual adjustment. The postman still follows his familiar route, though he occasionally carries letters addressed to people who no longer live where the envelopes expect to find them. Milk deliveries continue each morning, but bottles disappear from doorsteps more quickly as larger households consume them before the day has fully begun. Laundry lines remain stretched between brick walls, displaying shirts, aprons, children's clothes, and work trousers that no longer belong entirely to one family. Even these quiet domestic landscapes begin reflecting the temporary blending of lives brought together by circumstance rather than design. The churches of Dunkirk also become places where the changing nature of the town can be observed without anyone needing to speak of it directly. Wooden pews hold unfamiliar faces alongside familiar ones, their differences softened by the shared stillness of prayer or quiet reflection. Candles burn before small shrines exactly as they always have, though perhaps more are lit than in previous months. Some are offered for relatives left behind, others for sons already serving in distant units. Many simply represent hopes too uncertain to express in words. The churches offer no certainty about what lies ahead, yet they continue providing something equally necessary, a place where waiting can be shared rather than carried alone. As evening returns once more, the homes gradually settle into a rhythm that now feels almost established. Extra blankets are folded into the same corners each morning and spread across the same floors each night. Children learn which visitor tells the gentlest bedtime stories and which elderly guest enjoys watching the sunset from the back garden before darkness arrives. Hosts stop asking whether anyone needs another bowl of soup because they have already learned the answer. Guests begin helping with dishes, sweeping floors, or carrying water without waiting for invitations. What began as temporary shelter slowly develops into something quieter and more complex, a community adapting itself from within. Yet beneath this growing familiarity, uncertainty remains present like the distant sound of the sea beyond the rooftops. No one knows whether tomorrow will bring more arrivals or whether those already sheltered will soon continue their journeys. Every kindness is offered without knowing its duration. Every meal shared may be the last one around that particular table. The homes remain open, not because their owners possess confidence about the future, but because uncertainty itself has become another guest living quietly among them. And while the streets outside still preserve much of their ordinary appearance, the town's deepest transformation is now taking place behind its front doors, where compassion steadily expands to meet a world becoming less certain with every passing day. The army passing through. There comes a morning when the movement along the roads acquires a different rhythm. Until now, most arrivals have carried the careful pace of civilians traveling without certainty, adjusting their journeys according to children, weather, and exhaustion. Now another current begins flowing through the town, more deliberate and more disciplined, though no less weary. Military columns appear with increasing regularity, entering Dunkirk not as triumphant formations but as groups of men who have already spent many days moving farther north than many had ever imagined they would. The first impression is not one of strength alone. It is one of accumulation. Boots darkened by dried mud from roads stretching across northern France. Uniforms creased by nights spent sleeping wherever shelter could be found. Faces carrying the pale weariness that comes less from a single battle than from continual movement without knowing where the next halt will occur. Rifles remain carefully maintained despite the dust covering everything else. Packs hang heavily across shoulders that have learned to bear weight without complaint. These soldiers arrive not with the confidence of an advancing army but with the quiet concentration of men conserving energy for whatever tomorrow may demand. For the residents of Dunkirk, the sight gradually becomes familiar enough that individual columns begin blending into one another. Every few hours another unit appears beyond the southern streets, marching past rows of brick houses before disappearing toward the harbour district. Some wear British uniforms whose accents introduce unfamiliar sounds into cafes and bakeries. Others belong to French formations moving alongside them, exchanging brief gestures that require little shared language to understand. Occasionally Belgian troops appear among the flow, carrying with them yet another fragment of a retreat that has gathered people from many directions into the same narrowing corner of Europe. The roads themselves begin showing the physical evidence of this constant passage. Horse hooves and military vehicles press deeper tracks into the softened earth beside the pavements. Dust hangs longer in the still afternoon air after convoys have passed, settling upon windowsills, bicycles, market stalls, and flowering gardens with remarkable impartiality. Shopkeepers wipe the same wooden counters several times a day, only to discover another thin layer waiting by evening. The town does not resist these changes. It simply absorbs them, much as the harbour absorbs each incoming tide without protest. You notice how the presence of soldiers quietly alters the emotional geography of familiar places. A public square that normally echoes with market conversations now contains small groups of men studying folded maps before moving on again. Benches once occupied by retired fishermen discussing weather and tides provide brief resting places for exhausted infantrymen removing heavy packs from aching shoulders. Wells where local families have drawn water for generations now serve long queues of uniforms patiently waiting to refill bottles and canteens. The physical spaces remain unchanged, yet their purpose expands with every passing day. The soldiers themselves carry remarkably little of the dramatic urgency later generations often associate with famous campaigns. Most spend their pauses attending to simple necessities that would be recognizable in almost any place or century. Boots are inspected for worn stitching. Socks are dried whenever sunshine briefly appears. Letters, already folded many times over, are reread before being returned carefully to breast pockets. Tin mugs are rinsed. Buttons are sewn back onto tunics with surprising patience. The ordinary maintenance of daily life continues because it must. Even while armies retreat, uniforms still require mending and feet still require care if tomorrow's march is to remain possible. Residents observing these routines begin discovering that military life contains long stretches of quiet labor rarely captured by history's larger narratives. A blacksmith who normally repairs farming tools now spends much of his day straightening bent bicycle wheels and replacing broken fittings on military carts. A local seamstress finds herself sewing torn jackets whose owners will likely continue their journey before sunset. Bakers begin adjusting their schedules to produce more loaves earlier in the morning, knowing that columns often pass through before the town itself has fully awakened. None of these changes transforms civilian life overnight. Instead, they weave military necessity into existing routines until the distinction between serving neighbors and serving armies becomes increasingly difficult to separate. Beyond the streets, the countryside surrounding Dunkirk continues displaying the quiet confidence of late spring. Fields remain green beneath wide northern skies. Wind moves through young grain in long, gentle waves that resemble the sea lying just beyond the dunes. Cattle graze with complete indifference to the columns moving along distant roads. Swallows dart across open meadows gathering insects above newly growing crops. Nature continues marking the season according to sunlight and rainfall alone, offering a calm backdrop against which the steady movement of soldiers appears both immense and strangely temporary. The land has witnessed generations arrive and depart before. It simply watches another procession unfold across its familiar paths. As the days unfold, the movement of troops becomes so constant that the town gradually begins recognizing patterns within what at first seemed like an endless procession. Some units pass through with remarkable discipline, their boots striking the cobblestones in an even rhythm that echoes between rows of closely built houses before fading toward the waterfront. Others arrive in smaller groups, scattered by previous engagements or delayed by damaged roads, walking with the slower pace of men who have learned that haste is not always possible. Between them travel dispatch riders, ambulances, engineers, and supply vehicles, each contributing another thread to the steadily thickening fabric of military life settling over Dunkirk without yet completely replacing its civilian character. The cafes adapt almost instinctively. Owners who once expected fishermen to occupy the same corner tables every morning now find unfamiliar uniforms filling those spaces before sunrise. Conversation remains subdued, not because there is nothing to say, but because fatigue often proves stronger than curiosity. Soldiers warm their hands around chipped cups while studying maps whose folded edges have softened from repeated use. Local residents continue entering for breakfast, quietly making room where they can. A nod, a shared glance, or the simple gesture of sliding a chair slightly closer to another table becomes enough to acknowledge one another's presence. Hospitality rarely announces itself with speeches. More often, It is expressed through ordinary accommodations made without expectation of recognition. Along the narrow streets leading away from the harbor, bicycles remain an essential part of everyday life. Children still ride them to errands. Bakers continue balancing baskets upon their handlebars during early morning deliveries. Yet now bicycles also appear beneath military riders carrying messages between scattered headquarters and temporary command posts. Occasionally, a punctured tire brings one of these journeys to an unexpected halt outside a local repair shop. Mechanics who have spent years fixing civilian transport quietly resume their familiar work, patching tubes, tightening spokes, and adjusting chains while the rider waits nearby. For a few moments, the distinction between military urgency and ordinary craftsmanship disappears entirely beneath the universal necessity of keeping a wheel turning smoothly. You observe that waiting begins affecting the soldiers as deeply as marching. There are long intervals when no orders arrive, when movement pauses not because the journey has ended but because no one yet knows where the next stage will begin. During these quieter hours, uniforms are brushed clean of dried dust. Helmets are placed upon the ground while their owners stretch stiff backs and sore shoulders. Some men write brief letters that may never reach their destinations. Others simply watch the harbor, following fishing boats with their eyes as though the familiar rhythm of civilian life offers temporary relief from the uncertainty surrounding their own future. Waiting becomes another form of labor, requiring patience without the satisfaction of visible progress. For the people of Dunkirk, these pauses reveal the soldiers less as anonymous columns and more as ordinary individuals temporarily passing through extraordinary circumstances. A young infantryman carefully feeds crumbs to a pair of persistent sparrows outside a bakery while waiting for his unit to reform. An older reservist removes his boots beside a public fountain, quietly washing road dust from tired feet before lacing them once again. Two engineers spend nearly an hour repairing the wooden handle of a shovel rather than replacing it, understanding that useful tools cannot easily be discarded. Such moments rarely appear in official reports, yet they occupy much of military life. Armies move not only through strategy and command, but through countless acts of maintenance, patience, and quiet persistence. The churches remain open throughout these days, offering brief intervals of stillness amid the continual movement outside. Soldiers sometimes enter alone, removing caps before sitting silently in pews already occupied by local residents. Others remain only a minute or two before returning to the streets. There are few dramatic displays of emotion. More often, people simply allow themselves a short period free from engines, marching boots, and uncertain conversations. The cool stone interiors preserve a different sense of time, one measured less by military developments than by centuries of prayer, reflection, and ordinary human hope. Even those who do not stay long often leave carrying something difficult to define but quietly reassuring. Meanwhile, the harbor grows steadily busier. More vessels appear offshore each morning, some lying almost motionless beyond the breakwaters while others enter and depart according to instructions understood only by those directing the growing maritime effort. Residents standing along permitted sections of the waterfront begin noticing that the sea itself seems increasingly occupied. The open water which had once suggested freedom and distance now carries visible evidence that events are gathering toward a single point. Yet the exact purpose remains unclear to most observers. Ships arrive. Ships depart. Cranes continue lifting cargo. The pattern grows denser without revealing its conclusion. As dusk settles once again across Dunkirk, the streets do not empty in the familiar manner they once had. Military traffic continues well into the evening, softened by the muted glow of carefully shielded lamps. Somewhere beyond the rooftops, another column approaches from the south, its steady movement announced first by the faint vibration of engines carried through the cooling air. The town receives them as it has received every arrival during these recent weeks, with order, patience, and quiet endurance. Still, beneath that composed surface, another realization is beginning to form. The soldiers are no longer simply passing through Dunkirk. Increasingly, they are arriving without immediately leaving, and the town itself is slowly becoming less of a stopping place than the final edge of a narrowing road. Streets growing full. The change becomes visible not because any single street fills completely, but because fewer of them remain empty. During earlier weeks, military columns had flowed through Dunkirk with the steady rhythm of a river continuing toward the sea. Now that movement begins to slow. Men who might once have marched directly toward another destination spend longer hours within the town itself. Vehicles remain parked where they would previously have paused only briefly. Corners that had served as temporary gathering points gradually become places of prolonged waiting, their purpose quietly shifting without anyone formally announcing that they now belong to a different stage of the war. From an upstairs window overlooking one of the main approaches to the harbor, an elderly woman notices the difference before she can fully explain it. She has watched the same intersection for many years, observing fishermen returning before dawn, school children hurrying toward classrooms, and market carts arriving with vegetables harvested from nearby farms. The familiar rhythm has always been one of movement. People came and went. They lingered only long enough to exchange greetings or complete their errands before continuing elsewhere. Now the intersection seems reluctant to empty. Soldiers stand in small groups consulting maps that are folded away only to be unfolded again an hour later. Motorcycles remain leaning against walls long after their engines have cooled. Wagons stay where they were halted because no new instruction has yet arrived to send them onward. The shops continue opening every morning, though the distinction between customer and traveler grows increasingly uncertain. A baker serves local families exactly as he always has, yet the line extending onto the pavement now contains uniforms alongside aprons, steel helmets beside straw hats. Coins from different countries are placed upon the same wooden counter, occasionally requiring careful conversation to determine their value. The exchange remains polite, almost ordinary, but it reflects a town becoming the meeting place of many different journeys whose endings remain hidden beyond the horizon. The harbor roads no longer carry only disciplined columns advancing in recognizable formations. Individual vehicles begin appearing with wider intervals between them, some towing damaged equipment, others transporting men whose expressions reveal more concentration than conversation. Ambulances pass quietly through the streets, their drivers avoiding unnecessary speed because haste would accomplish little upon roads already crowded with people and supplies. Engineers pause beside bridges, examining structures that local residents have crossed daily without ever considering how much weight they could bear or how quickly they might need repair. Familiar infrastructure begins attracting unfamiliar attention. You notice that time itself feels subtly altered. Waiting no longer appears to be a brief interruption before the next stage of movement. Instead, waiting becomes the day's principal occupation. Soldiers clean equipment already cleaned yesterday because there is little else to do until fresh orders arrive. Drivers inspect engines that may not start again until nightfall. Officers walk repeatedly between command posts carrying messages that often revise plans already discussed only hours earlier. Civilian volunteers continue distributing bread, water, and simple meals, though they too begin recognizing faces they served the previous day. Temporary encounters gradually acquire the quiet familiarity of repeated meetings. The sounds of the town reflect this slowing rhythm. Earlier, the dominant noise had been the continual arrival of engines and marching boots. Now long intervals of subdued conversation settle between those movements. Metal cups strike against one another as tea is poured into waiting hands. Bicycle bells weave gently through groups standing along the roadside. Somewhere a carpenter continues repairing a broken door, his hammer sounding remarkably unchanged despite everything unfolding around him. Ordinary labor persists, but it now shares the air with thousands of people suspended between past movement and future uncertainty. Along the canals, barges still travel toward the harbor, though their progress is increasingly careful. Waterways that once seemed generously wide now require greater coordination as civilian craft, military vessels, and service boats negotiate passage through locks that continue operating with patient precision. Lock keepers maintain their ledgers as they always have, recording each movement in careful handwriting despite the growing complexity surrounding them. Their discipline reflects something quietly reassuring. Even while circumstances change rapidly, certain responsibilities continue demanding accuracy, order, and calm attention. Beyond the edge of town, the roads leading south remain visible beneath broad skies crossed by drifting clouds. Yet they no longer suggest the same promise of onward movement they once held. Dust still rises in the distance, but each approaching column appears to travel more slowly than the last. The landscape itself has not altered. Fields remain green. Wind continues bending the grain in long, gentle waves. Poplar trees cast familiar shadows across roadside ditches. Nature preserves its steady rhythm, while human movement begins gathering instead of flowing. Dunkirk is becoming less a passage toward somewhere else and more a place where countless journeys have paused together, waiting for events still hidden beyond the horizon to determine whether they will continue at all. By the following morning, the town begins discovering that space itself has become a valuable resource. Courtyards once used only for deliveries now shelter parked military bicycles and handcarts stacked neatly beneath canvas sheets. Schoolyards, quiet after lessons have been suspended, hold rows of vehicles positioned with careful order rather than haste. Open squares continue serving their civic purpose, but every empty corner seems gradually claimed by another temporary necessity. The transformation is not chaotic. It is methodical, almost gentle, as though the town is slowly lending each available piece of itself to the growing demands placed upon it. Residents adapt with the quiet practicality that has carried coastal communities through difficult seasons for generations. Shopkeepers shift displays closer together to create a little more room inside their premises. Warehouse owners reorganize storage that had remained unchanged for years, discovering forgotten corners where additional supplies may be kept dry. Families become accustomed to stepping aside while military traffic passes, then resuming their conversations almost exactly where they had left them. These adjustments require attention rather than heroism. They accumulate one beside another until ordinary life has been subtly rewritten without anyone ever declaring that a new routine has begun. Food remains one of the clearest measures of this changing balance. Bakers rise even earlier than before, their ovens glowing while much of the town still sleeps beneath a pale coastal sky. The familiar scent of fresh bread continues drifting through narrow streets, reassuring precisely because it has changed so little. Yet behind the counters, loaves are divided more carefully, flour is measured with greater precision, and nothing is allowed to go to waste. Meals become exercises in thoughtful distribution rather than abundance. A little extra soup is stretched with another handful of vegetables. A loaf that might once have served one household now quietly serves two. You notice that queues have acquired a different character. Earlier they had formed briefly before shops opened, dissolving as morning routines resumed. Now they remain throughout much of the day, though rarely with impatience. People wait because waiting has become part of nearly every task. Waiting for bread. Waiting for news. Waiting for transport. Waiting for instructions that may or may not arrive before evening. Conversations drift gently along these lines of quiet expectation, seldom rising above the respectful tone shared by strangers who understand that everyone nearby carries burdens not immediately visible. The harbour district reflects this new stillness with particular clarity. Vehicles remain parked along quays where they once stopped only long enough to unload or collect supplies. Drivers sit beside them reading old newspapers, writing letters, or simply watching the water while engines cool beneath open bonnets. Mechanics move steadily from one vehicle to another, tightening bolts, replacing worn hoses, and checking tires whose long journeys have left visible scars upon the rubber. Maintenance becomes a way of preparing for movement that cannot yet begin. Every repaired engine represents faith that another road will eventually open. Even the weather seems to encourage observation rather than action. Low clouds drift inland from the channel, softening the sunlight until the streets appear wrapped in muted grey tones. A light breeze carries the smell of salt across rooftops before disappearing among rows of brick houses where washing still hangs from clotheslines despite the growing military presence below. Occasionally a brief shower darkens the cobblestones, sending pedestrians beneath shop awnings until the rain passes as quietly as it arrived. These familiar changes of weather continue reminding the town that nature keeps its own calendar, untouched by the uncertainty filling human schedules. Inside municipal offices, the work has become less visible but no less demanding. Clerks continue recording names, deliveries, permits, and requests with careful handwriting despite the growing volume of paperwork crossing their desks. Telephones ring more frequently than before, though many conversations end without definite answers. Maps pinned to walls accumulate small penciled notes that are erased and replaced again within hours. Administration persists through discipline rather than certainty. Even as information becomes increasingly incomplete, the habit of orderly record-keeping offers one of the few remaining forms of stability. As evening settles once more across Dunkirk, the streets remain noticeably fuller than they were only a short time ago. Lamps glow behind curtained windows while outside, soldiers, civilians, refugees, and local workers continue sharing the same carefully negotiated spaces. There is remarkably little disorder, only an ever-deepening sense that the town has reached a point where movement alone can no longer explain what is happening. The roads have delivered thousands of people to the edge of the sea, but now the sea itself begins to command everyone's attention. Eyes linger a little longer upon the harbour entrance, upon the distant horizon beyond the breakwaters, and upon the wide waters of the channel, where answers have not yet appeared but where many quietly suspect the next chapter of waiting will unfold. Looking toward the water. The sea has always been present, though most days it asks very little of the people living beside it. It provides work for fishermen, passage for merchant ships, changing weather for farmers who glance toward the horizon before beginning their day, and a place where families walk together during quiet evenings when the tide retreats across broad stretches of wet sand. It is constant without demanding constant attention. Like the wind or the church bells, it belongs to the background of life so completely that many residents scarcely notice how often they measure their days against its familiar rhythm. Now, almost without discussion, the town begins looking toward it more frequently than before. People standing at bus stops or outside bakeries pause in the middle of conversation whenever someone points toward the channel. Shopkeepers leaving their premises to sweep the pavement allow their eyes to linger beyond the rooftops before returning to their work. Children climbing the dunes no longer race immediately toward the beach but stop first at the crest, searching the horizon for ships whose shapes they have begun trying to recognize. Even those with no connection to the harbour find themselves developing quiet habits of observation, as though the sea has become a page upon which tomorrow's news might eventually be written. The breakwaters stretching into the water remain familiar structures, built through years of engineering and patient maintenance to calm the harbour against winter storms. Their heavy stones have witnessed countless tides arriving from the channel, each wave polishing their surfaces a little more smoothly than the last. Elderly residents remember walking there as children with parents who explained the names of passing vessels or pointed toward distant coastlines barely visible on exceptionally clear days. Nothing about the breakwaters has physically changed. Yet the people standing upon them have begun looking outward with different expectations. The vessels anchored offshore also seem different now, though many of them would once have passed unnoticed. Cargo ships, patrol craft, trawlers adapted for military use, and naval vessels occupy positions that appear carefully chosen rather than accidental. Some remain motionless throughout the day, rising gently with the tide while crews continue unseen work below decks. Others move slowly across the horizon before disappearing into mist that settles over the channel during the cooler hours of morning. Residents attempt to understand these movements through observation alone. One ship arrives where another departed. Small boats travel repeatedly between larger vessels and the harbor. Patterns begin emerging, though their purpose remains uncertain. You notice how observation itself becomes a shared occupation. Conversations increasingly begin with the words, "Did you see?" rather than "Did you hear?" Someone believes there were more destroyers offshore before dawn than yesterday. Another is convinced several fishing boats have disappeared from their usual moorings. A woman hanging laundry in her garden remarks that aircraft have been flying lower over the coast during the afternoon. None of these observations explains the whole picture, yet together they create a quiet form of communal awareness. The town studies its surroundings with increasing care because certainty has become too valuable to waste. Along the beaches, daily life continues with remarkable restraint. The sand still carries footprints left by fishermen checking nets close to shore before sunrise. Dogs continue running ahead of their owners, stopping occasionally to investigate driftwood washed in during the night. Children gather shells whose smooth surfaces have been shaped by years of patient tides rather than recent events. Yet the beaches also feel subtly quieter. Families remain closer together than they once did. Walks become shorter. More time is spent simply standing, watching the sea without speaking. The coastline itself encourages contemplation, offering a wide horizon upon which expectation gradually settles like the evening mist. The harbor pilots, whose profession has always depended upon careful reading of tides, currents, and changing weather, discover that their knowledge has acquired unexpected importance. Men who have spent decades guiding merchant vessels safely through shifting sandbanks now find themselves answering questions far beyond ordinary navigation. Which channels remain deepest during low tide? Where might larger ships anchor safely if weather deteriorates? How quickly can changing winds alter conditions at the harbor entrance? Their experience, accumulated slowly across countless peaceful years, now becomes part of preparations whose full purpose they themselves cannot entirely see. As afternoon light begins softening across the water, reflections shimmer between anchored vessels and the harbor walls, blurring the boundary between sea and sky. Gulls circle patiently above fishing boats still working close to shore, while farther out the silhouettes of larger ships remain almost perfectly still against the pale horizon. The entire coastline seems suspended between familiar routine and approaching transformation. Nothing dramatic interrupts the calm. No single vessel announces what is to come. Yet everywhere along the waterfront, people continue returning their gaze to the same stretch of open water, quietly sensing that whatever future awaits Dunkirk will almost certainly arrive not from the land they have watched for weeks, but from the sea that has accompanied them all their lives. As the days pass, the habit of watching the channel becomes almost as regular as the tides themselves. There are people who find reasons to walk toward the seawall each morning before beginning work, telling themselves they simply wish to feel the fresh air or judge the weather for the day ahead. Others pause there during the quiet hour after lunch, leaning gently against the cool stone while allowing their eyes to travel across the water. By evening, Another small gathering often forms without arrangement or invitation. No speeches are given. No conclusions are reached. The sea simply draws observers who have begun believing that careful attention might reveal what official announcements cannot. The weather refuses to cooperate with certainty. Some mornings begin beneath clear skies where distant ships can be distinguished almost to the shape of their masts. On other days, low cloud and drifting mist reduce the horizon to a pale grey line where sea and sky appear to merge into one another. The Channel has always possessed this changing character. Fishermen have trusted it enough to earn their living upon its waters while never assuming it would remain predictable for long. Now the same shifting visibility affects everyone waiting ashore. A vessel that disappears into fog may simply have continued its ordinary course, yet those watching cannot help wondering whether it has entered a story unfolding beyond their sight. Along the dunes, the wind continues shaping the landscape with quiet persistence. Fine sand moves in delicate ribbons across the beach, softening yesterday's footprints until only faint impressions remain. Marram grass bends and rises again with each passing gust, holding the shoreline together through countless unseen roots buried beneath the surface. These patient movements have continued for generations without attracting much notice, but now they seem almost comforting. They remind the town that some forms of endurance require no announcement. Nature survives not through haste or force, but through repetition carried faithfully across the years. You notice that people begin measuring the day by what they have observed upon the water. Someone remarks that several small craft entered the harbor shortly after sunrise. Another quietly insists that more naval vessels remained offshore overnight than during the previous week. A retired fisherman studies the currents and suggests that certain anchorages have been chosen because they offer shelter if the wind shifts suddenly from the northwest. None of these conversations grows heated. They remain thoughtful, almost tentative, as though everyone understands that certainty should not be claimed too easily. Observation has become more valuable than opinion. The harbor offices continue their steady work behind closed doors. Clerks copy figures into ledgers whose pages grow steadily thicker with each passing day. Harbor masters receive captains in brief meetings before returning to charts spread across well-worn desks. Messengers arrive on bicycles, hand over sealed envelopes, and depart again without lingering. To anyone passing outside, these buildings still resemble the administrative heart of an ordinary commercial port. Inside, however, the tempo has changed. Decisions once concerned cargo schedules and docking priorities. Increasingly, they concern space, timing, and possibilities that extend beyond the harbor itself. On the beaches, ordinary life has not disappeared, but it has become more restrained. Parents allow children to collect shells and smooth stones, though they call them back sooner than before. Couples walking along the shoreline spend longer intervals standing quietly beside one another without speaking. The sea possesses an unusual ability to invite reflection, and during these days it seems almost everyone carries private thoughts that resist easy conversation. The gentle rhythm of waves arriving upon the sand offers no answers, yet it provides a steady accompaniment to waiting, allowing anxious minds to rest, if only briefly, upon something older and more dependable than the events unfolding around them. As twilight settles across the coast, the first lights begin appearing aboard ships anchored beyond the harbor entrance. They are small and distant, scattered across the darkening water like stars reflected upon the surface of the channel. From the shore, it is impossible to know what conversations are taking place aboard those vessels, what orders are being written, or what plans are slowly taking shape beneath their decks. The people of Dunkirk see only the lights themselves, steady against the gathering darkness, suggesting presence without explanation. The town retires for another night beneath the quiet breathing of the sea. Windows are closed against the cool evening air. Lamps are extinguished one by one. Somewhere in the distance, a ship's horn sounds softly across the water before silence gradually returns. Yet even as homes settle into sleep, the harbor remains awake, and the channel continues carrying ships whose purpose is becoming increasingly significant. The waiting has not ended. It has merely shifted its attention. The roads have delivered the war to the coast. Now every thoughtful glance toward the water carries the growing realization that the sea itself may soon determine the fate of everyone who has gathered at its edge. The town left behind. The morning arrives with a different quality of quiet. It is not that the harbor has fallen silent, nor that the streets have emptied. In fact, there are more people than ever moving through Dunkirk. Yet beneath the steady sounds of engines, footsteps, and distant gulls, another absence begins making itself known. The future, which only days before had seemed uncertain in many possible directions, now feels as though it is slowly narrowing toward a single path that no one can fully describe. The town senses this change before it understands it. The soldiers still occupy the streets, but they no longer carry themselves like travelers expecting another march inland. Their movements have become more localized, measured by the distance between warehouses, quays, temporary headquarters, and resting places rather than by long roads stretching toward unfamiliar villages. Maps are consulted repeatedly, not because new territory must be crossed, but because familiar streets have acquired unexpected importance. Every junction, canal crossing, and warehouse doorway now belongs to a landscape whose meaning has changed within only a few days. For the civilians of Dunkirk, another realization quietly begins taking shape. Until now, the town has imagined itself as part of a larger movement sweeping northward across France. Refugees arrived. Soldiers arrived. Vehicles arrived. Everything suggested passage. Now the direction itself begins dissolving. More people remain than depart. Those who do leave rarely travel inland anymore. Their journeys point toward the harbor or the beaches instead. The sea has become less a boundary than the final remaining horizon. Shops continue opening each morning because habit remains stronger than speculation. Bakers still light their ovens before dawn. Grocers arrange vegetables whose freshness continues obeying the ordinary calendar of spring rather than the extraordinary calendar of war. Tailors repair worn clothing beneath windows where sunlight falls across work tables exactly as it always has. Yet the customers entering these businesses increasingly ask practical questions that would once have seemed unusual. How much flour remains? Will another delivery arrive? Is there enough thread to mend another jacket? The transactions remain courteous, but each carries the quiet understanding that supplies now belong to an uncertain future. You notice that conversations have also changed. Earlier, people spoke about roads, villages, and the steady approach of events unfolding elsewhere. Now discussions remain focused upon the town itself. Which streets are most crowded today? Has another section of the harbor been closed to civilians? Were more ships visible offshore this morning than yesterday? The geographical imagination of the community contracts, becoming concentrated upon the immediate surroundings because those surroundings now contain almost everything that matters. Along the waterfront, familiar routines continue surviving within altered circumstances. Fishermen still inspect nets that remain useful only where conditions permit them to work. Harbor workers continue coiling ropes whose fibers feel reassuringly ordinary beneath experienced hands. Small maintenance tasks proceed without interruption. A loose plank is replaced along one pier. A damaged bollard is reinforced before it can fail beneath another heavy mooring line. These acts of preservation may appear insignificant beside the wider events unfolding around Dunkirk, yet they reveal something essential. Even when history presses heavily upon a place, people continue repairing what stands directly before them. The churches fill quietly throughout the day with individuals arriving at different hours rather than as a single congregation. Some remain only a few minutes, sitting motionless beneath familiar stone arches before returning to the streets outside. Others linger longer, allowing the cool stillness of the sanctuary to separate them briefly from the constant movement beyond its doors. There are no dramatic scenes, no public declarations. Instead, the churches become places where uncertainty is acknowledged without requiring explanation. The silence they offer differs from the silence waiting outside. It possesses structure, familiarity, and the gentle comfort of repetition practiced across generations. Toward evening, the light settles softly across the rooftops before reaching the harbor beyond them. From higher windows, residents observe the same streets they have known all their lives, yet they now recognize how completely those streets have become intertwined with events far greater than the town itself. The familiar geometry of brick buildings, narrow alleys, canals, and market squares remains unchanged. What has altered is their purpose. Dunkirk is no longer simply a coastal community living beside the channel. It has become a place where thousands wait together beside the water, while those who have always called it home begin realizing, almost reluctantly, that history will soon remember their town for what others came to do there, rather than for the quiet lives that had filled these streets long before the world arrived. Night settles gradually across Dunkirk, softening the outlines of warehouses, church towers, and rows of closely built houses until the town seems to draw itself inward beneath the darkness. Lamps appear behind curtains exactly as they always have, though fewer windows remain uncovered for long. Light has become something used with greater care. Doors are closed a little earlier. Voices remain lower when conversations drift toward uncertain possibilities. None of these habits is imposed by formal instruction alone. They emerge naturally from a community learning that discretion can become another quiet form of security. The harbor never truly sleeps. Even when much of the town rests, footsteps continue echoing across timber piers damp with evening dew. Mooring lines are inspected beneath shaded lanterns whose glow barely reaches the water below. Somewhere out in the darkness, an engine turns over before settling into a steady rhythm, while another vessel answers with the deep, restrained note of its horn. These sounds drift inland on the cool air, entering bedrooms where families have long measured their nights by the familiar language of the port. The noises themselves are not entirely new. Their meaning, however, has become different. Every movement upon the water now suggests preparation rather than routine commerce. Inside the houses that have remained open to strangers, evenings have acquired an established rhythm. Boots are left neatly beside doorways to dry before morning. Borrowed blankets are folded with practiced care, then spread once again across familiar corners of sitting rooms when darkness returns. Children who only weeks earlier had never met one another now exchange whispered stories before sleep overtakes them, speaking softly so the adults nearby may continue their quiet conversations without interruption. Temporary arrangements have become so well practiced that they begin resembling traditions, though everyone understands they were born not from custom but from necessity. You observe how people slowly become accustomed to uncertainty without ever becoming comfortable with it. They no longer ask whether tomorrow will resemble yesterday because experience has already answered that question. Instead, they begin preparing themselves for smaller unknowns. Will the bakery open at its usual hour? Will the post arrive? Will another family seek shelter before nightfall? Will the streets remain passable? Life narrows into questions that can be faced one day at a time, allowing ordinary responsibilities to continue even while larger answers remain beyond reach. Along the market streets, many shopkeepers leave displays more modest than before, preserving goods whose replacement can no longer be taken for granted. Shelves that once appeared comfortably full now reveal small gaps between carefully arranged items. Customers notice these spaces without comment. The absence of abundance does not immediately produce alarm. It encourages thoughtfulness instead. Purchases become more deliberate. Waste becomes almost unthinkable. A broken tool is repaired rather than replaced. A worn coat receives another careful patch. Everyday objects quietly acquire longer lives because people have begun measuring value differently. The harbour district reflects the same gradual adjustment. Fishermen continue maintaining vessels even on days when sailing seems uncertain. Nets are dried, repaired, and neatly coiled because neglect would only invite greater difficulty later. Carpenters replace damaged planks on small boats whose future employment no one can confidently predict. Blacksmiths continue sharpening tools that may soon serve purposes different from those for which they were originally made. Maintenance becomes an act of quiet faith. Caring for familiar things preserves a sense of continuity when larger circumstances refuse to do so. Beyond the breakwaters, the channel stretches into darkness beneath a sky where only a handful of stars remain visible through drifting cloud. The water appears calm from shore, though those who know these tides understand how quickly conditions can change beneath the surface. The sea offers no hint of intention. It simply continues its endless breathing against the coast, patient and indifferent, carrying vessels through the night while the town waits upon its edge. For generations, Dunkirk has looked toward these waters for livelihood. Now it looks toward them for something far less familiar, though no less essential. By the time another dawn begins gathering beyond the eastern rooftops, the town has quietly crossed an invisible threshold. Waiting remains its dominant condition, but the nature of that waiting has changed. It is no longer directed toward the approaching war. The war has already arrived and settled into the streets, the harbour, the homes, and the daily routines of those who remain. What lies ahead will not be determined by the roads leading into Dunkirk, but by the water stretching outward beyond the harbour walls. The town understands this without needing to speak it aloud, and together its people continue turning their gaze toward the sea, where the next chapter of their long vigil is slowly beginning. The shoreline of waiting. Morning light reaches the beaches long before it enters the narrow streets behind them. The eastern horizon brightens gradually, allowing the damp sand to reflect soft bands of silver and pale gold before the sun itself appears above the low clouds. At this early hour the tide is retreating, exposing broad stretches of firm shoreline marked by shallow pools that mirror the changing sky. For generations, these beaches have belonged to ordinary mornings. Fishermen have crossed them carrying nets over their shoulders. Children have searched for shells left behind by the night sea. Families have wandered here after breakfast simply to breathe the salt air and watch distant ships pass beyond the horizon. Now the beaches begin serving another purpose while never entirely surrendering the memory of the first. The sand records every arrival with impartial patience. Boot prints mingle beside the lighter impressions left by children's shoes, bicycle tires, handcarts, and the paws of dogs still unaware that the world around them has changed. The tide accepts them all equally. Each wave smooths the surface before retreating once more, erasing distinctions almost as quickly as they appear. Nature continues practicing its ancient rhythm while human history briefly borrows the shoreline for purposes beyond anything it had previously known. Groups of soldiers begin reaching the dunes earlier each morning, though many remain surprisingly quiet after the long days that have brought them here. They do not hurry directly toward the water. Instead, they settle where space permits, lowering heavy packs onto the sand with visible relief before sitting beside them. Some remove helmets for a few moments, allowing the sea breeze to cool foreheads marked by weeks beneath unfamiliar skies. Others simply look across the channel without speaking, as though distance itself has become something worthy of careful study. The coastline encourages silence more readily than conversation. The civilians living nearest the beach continue observing these changes from windows overlooking the dunes or while walking familiar footpaths that now require gentle negotiation around growing numbers of resting men. They carry on with practical errands whenever possible. Fishermen still inspect the weather before deciding whether small boats can safely leave the harbor. Mothers continue collecting driftwood washed ashore after recent tides because fuel remains valuable regardless of circumstances elsewhere. Elderly couples pause where they have paused for years, though now they stand slightly farther back, quietly acknowledging that the shoreline no longer belongs entirely to those who have always called it home. You notice how waiting acquires a physical shape upon the beach. It appears in carefully stacked equipment arranged beside its owners rather than hurriedly discarded. It appears in lines of men patiently cleaning rifles already free of obvious dirt simply because occupied hands help steady occupied minds. It appears in the slow sharing of food carried in nearly empty packs, where every crust of bread and every sip of water is measured without complaint. Waiting is no longer merely an idea. It has settled into posture, routine, and movement, becoming visible through countless small actions repeated across the shoreline hour after hour. The sea remains deceptively calm. Gentle waves continue rolling toward the sand with exactly the same rhythm they carried before armies reached the coast. Gulls circle overhead, occasionally descending to investigate scraps left behind by the growing crowds before rising effortlessly into the wind again. Far offshore, vessels remain scattered across the channel, their outlines softened by distance until they resemble dark brushstrokes resting upon the pale water. From the beach, it is impossible to judge their intentions. They seem both close enough to imagine reaching and impossibly distant at the same time. Throughout the morning, more soldiers continue arriving from inland roads, though the pace has slowed compared with earlier weeks. Their journeys now end not with another march order but with the sea before them. Many spend long periods simply orienting themselves, locating companions, finding space upon the sand, and quietly accepting that this coastline has become, for the moment, the limit of their movement. Behind them lies the long retreat across northern France. Ahead stretches open water whose significance grows more apparent with every passing hour. Between those two worlds rests the beach itself, broad, windswept, and unexpectedly patient, holding thousands of lives in suspension while both land and sea seem to wait together beneath the widening morning sky. As the day lengthens, the beach settles into a rhythm unlike any it has known before. From a distance, the gathering of men appears almost motionless, broken only by occasional figures walking slowly along the waterline or climbing the dunes to gain a better view across the channel. Yet within that apparent stillness, countless small routines quietly unfold. Canteens are refilled where fresh water can still be found. Blankets are shaken free of sand before being folded again with deliberate care. Boots are emptied, relaced, and tightened for journeys that no one can yet describe. The waiting is active rather than idle, sustained by ordinary tasks that preserve a sense of purpose while larger decisions remain elsewhere. The dunes themselves offer modest shelter from the persistent coastal wind. Their grasses sway steadily throughout the afternoon, bending low before rising again with quiet resilience. Men sit among them in scattered groups, grateful for even the slightest protection from the open shoreline. Some rest with eyes closed, though few truly sleep. Others study the sea through borrowed binoculars or simply shade their eyes with weathered hands, trying to distinguish one distant vessel from another. Every new silhouette on the horizon invites careful attention before gradually becoming part of the familiar pattern of ships already waiting offshore. The civilians who continue crossing these beaches move with thoughtful consideration. A fisherman pulling a small handcart pauses before altering his usual route so as not to disturb those resting on the sand. A woman collecting driftwood nods quietly as she passes groups of soldiers, exchanging no words because none seem necessary. Children, guided gently by parents, remain closer to the dunes than they once did, their games becoming quieter, more observant, as they absorb the unusual atmosphere surrounding them. The beach has not ceased belonging to the town, but it is now being shared in a manner no previous generation could have imagined. You begin to notice that the shoreline has become a place where time is measured differently. Clocks still exist, tucked into pockets or hanging upon walls back in the town, but here they seem less important than the changing tide, the movement of clouds, or the appearance of ships beyond the horizon. People begin speaking in terms of mornings, afternoons, and evenings rather than precise hours. They remember when the mist lifted, when the wind changed direction, or when another column reached the dunes. Nature quietly resumes its ancient role as the keeper of time, gently displacing the certainty once offered by timetables and schedules. Food is shared with quiet economy. A loaf of bread is divided carefully among several hands. Small tins of preserved meat are opened with deliberate patience, every portion measured without discussion. Someone produces an apple that has survived days of travel, slicing it into thin pieces so each companion receives a taste. These meals are neither festive nor bleak. They are practical, sustained by the quiet understanding that nourishment is valuable not because it satisfies hunger completely, but because it allows another day of endurance to begin when morning returns. Farther along the beach, military engineers continue their patient work. They walk the shoreline studying gradients, the firmness of wet sand, and the changing edge of the tide with the careful attention usually reserved for craftsmen inspecting familiar materials. Their observations remain largely invisible to those watching from a distance. They measure rather than speculate, recording details that may become important later. Like the harbor pilots and lockkeepers before them, they contribute not through dramatic action but through accumulated knowledge of place, tide, and terrain. The landscape itself becomes something to be read with precision. The sea continues, offering no explanation. Gentle waves smooth away footprints left only hours earlier, replacing them with fresh, untouched sand that will soon receive another 1,000 impressions. Each tide quietly erases evidence of waiting without ending the waiting itself. Looking across the water, the coastline of England remains beyond sight, hidden by distance and the subtle curve of the earth. What can be seen instead are scattered vessels resting upon the channel, their presence steady but enigmatic. They neither approach quickly nor disappear entirely. They simply remain, becoming familiar fixtures upon the horizon around which hope and uncertainty slowly gather together. As evening begins lowering its soft light across the beach, the crowds remain where they are, shaped now by the long hours of observation rather than movement. The wind carries the scent of salt through rows of resting men, across the dunes, and back toward the town whose rooftops glow faintly beneath the setting sun. Dunkirk has become a place suspended between land and sea, between departure and remaining, between what has already been endured and what has not yet arrived. The shoreline holds that uncertainty with remarkable calm, asking nothing of those gathered upon it except patience, while beyond the quiet rhythm of the waves, the channel continues keeping its own counsel. Under occupation skies. The first changes do not arrive with dramatic gestures. They emerge through absence. One morning, the familiar stream of soldiers moving through the streets has noticeably diminished. Roads that only days before carried an almost uninterrupted procession of uniforms now contain longer stretches of quiet between each passing vehicle. The harbor still works. The cafes still open. Bakers continue placing fresh loaves behind polished glass. Yet something within the movement of the town has altered so gently that many residents struggle to identify it immediately. Only after standing at familiar corners for several mornings do they realize that the current flowing through Dunkirk has begun to slow towards stillness. The beaches remain marked by recent days, though the tide has already softened many of the countless footprints that once covered the wet sand. Wind moves patiently across the dunes, carrying grains of sand that settle into shallow hollows before being lifted again moments later. Nature wastes little time reclaiming surfaces temporarily borrowed by history. The coastline resumes its ancient conversation with the sea, even while the memories of waiting remain vivid among those who stood there watching the horizon. For the civilians who never left, another season of waiting quietly begins. It is a different kind of waiting now. The uncertainty surrounding arrival gradually gives way to uncertainty surrounding permanence. Families awaken each morning not wondering how many more soldiers will enter the town, but how daily life will continue under circumstances that have become unmistakably new. The questions shift almost imperceptibly. Which shops will remain open? Which streets may still be crossed freely? Which familiar routines can continue unchanged, and which must quietly adapt to realities no one would have imagined only weeks earlier? The harbor reflects this transformation with remarkable restraint. Fishing boats remain tied alongside the quays where generations have secured them before dawn. Warehouses still stand beneath weathered brick walls stained by salt carried inland from countless tides. Cranes continue rising above the waterfront exactly as they always have. Yet the rhythm surrounding these familiar structures feels more measured, more deliberate. New regulations appear not through loud declarations but through carefully posted notices, newly placed barriers, and conversations that end with polite instructions rather than open discussion. The physical landscape remains largely intact while the invisible rules governing it quietly change. You notice how people begin learning these new boundaries with cautious attention. A street that once provided the shortest route to the market now requires a longer walk because access has become restricted. A warehouse doorway left open throughout every working day now remains closed except during specified hours. Harbor workers pause before approaching areas where they once entered without thought, waiting for permission that would previously have seemed unnecessary. Adaptation unfolds not through dramatic confrontation but through repetition. Each day teaches another small adjustment until unfamiliar customs gradually begin resembling ordinary habits. Inside the homes of Dunkirk, life continues with remarkable determination. Breakfast is still prepared before work begins. Floors are swept. Gardens are tended where space permits. Clothing is mended beneath windows through which the same coastal light continues to fall each morning. These routines possess greater significance than their simplicity suggests. They preserve continuity in a world where so much else has quietly shifted. Ordinary labor becomes an anchor, reminding families that identity can survive even while circumstances change around it. The churches once again become places where silence gathers naturally. Their cool stone interiors remain unchanged despite everything occurring outside their heavy wooden doors. Candles continue burning with small, steady flames beneath familiar statues whose expressions have watched generations arrive seeking comfort during illness, storms, poor harvests, and previous wars. Now another generation enters quietly, sitting for a few moments without asking large questions or expecting immediate answers. They simply rest within a place whose rhythm has not yet been rewritten. Toward evening, the streets grow calm beneath a sky washed with the pale colors of the northern coast. The sea breeze continues carrying the scent of salt between rows of brick houses exactly as it always has. Somewhere beyond the harbor, gulls circle above quiet water while church bells mark another passing hour. At first glance, Dunkirk appears almost peaceful once again. Yet beneath that familiar appearance lies a town learning to inhabit an entirely different reality, one measured less by movement than by endurance, and less by the uncertainty of approaching events than by the steady discipline required to continue living after they have arrived. Morning arrives beneath low clouds drifting inland from the channel, covering the town in a soft grey light that seems to reduce sharp edges without diminishing detail. Chimneys continue releasing thin columns of smoke into the cool air, and somewhere a bicycle bell rings as a baker begins another delivery along streets whose appearance remains comfortingly familiar. At first glance, little distinguishes this morning from dozens before it. Yet familiarity now exists alongside constant awareness. Every journey through the town requires slightly more attention than it once did, not because danger announces itself openly, but because ordinary movement has acquired quiet conditions that must be remembered. The market square continues serving the community, though its rhythm has become more restrained. Stalls are arranged with the same care as before, vegetables displayed neatly despite more modest quantities, fish laid carefully upon crushed ice where it remains available, baskets of bread positioned to catch the first customers arriving after sunrise. People still greet one another warmly, but conversations now pause more often before turning towards subjects that once would have seemed harmless. Familiar faces remain trusted, yet no one can always know who else may be listening nearby. Caution enters daily speech gradually, settling into conversation as naturally as lowered voices inside a library. Harbor workers begin each day much as they always have. They unlock storage buildings, inspect ropes damp from the night air, and walk the length of the quays looking for anything requiring repair before heavier work begins. Their experience continues guiding every movement. A worn mooring line is replaced before it can fail. Loose boards are secured beneath steady hands that have performed the same task countless times over many peaceful years. Yet every job now unfolds beneath a different administrative order. Permission is requested more frequently. Access is more carefully controlled. Work remains familiar, while authority quietly changes the framework surrounding it. You observe how people become remarkably skilled at preserving ordinary life within altered circumstances. A mother still pauses to straighten her child's coat before sending them across the street. Neighbors continue exchanging vegetables from small gardens hidden behind brick walls. Laundry still hangs between houses whenever the weather allows, moving gently in the coastal breeze that refuses to recognize political boundaries or military occupation. These ordinary gestures acquire unexpected significance because they represent choices that remain available. They are not acts of defiance. They are acts of continuity, preserving rhythms inherited from earlier years when such routines required no conscious protection. The schools that continue operating where possible also adapt through quiet persistence. Teachers write lessons across familiar blackboards while children copy neat handwriting into exercise books that have become more precious than before. Geography, arithmetic, reading, and history still occupy the morning hours, though the world outside classroom windows has changed beyond recognition. Children continue asking questions with the same natural curiosity they always have, yet adults discover that answers now require greater care. Some truths must wait until understanding has grown alongside experience. Childhood continues moving forward, even while the adult world seems determined to stand still. Throughout the neighborhoods, bicycles remain among the most dependable companions of everyday life. They carry nurses to patients, workers to the harbor, and families to markets where supplies permit. Mechanics spend long hours repairing tires that would once have been replaced without hesitation, carefully preserving rubber that has become increasingly valuable. Chains are cleaned, bearings adjusted, and worn brake pads reshaped by patient hands. Every successful repair extends the usefulness of an ordinary machine whose quiet reliability now supports much of the town's daily existence. Beyond the breakwaters, the channel continues its endless conversation with wind and tide. Fishing boats venture out whenever conditions permit, returning with catches that are greeted with quiet gratitude rather than celebration. The sea has never guaranteed abundance. It has always rewarded patience more often than certainty. Those who have lived beside it understand this instinctively. Now the same lesson extends beyond fishing. Days are approached one at a time. Expectations remain modest. Hope is measured less by dramatic change than by the successful completion of another ordinary morning, another shared meal, another evening during which familiar faces return safely through the front door. As dusk slowly settles once again across Dunkirk, the rooftops catch the last pale light before surrendering to the blue-grey tones of approaching night. The town has entered a quieter phase of its long ordeal, one in which endurance is no longer expressed through movement toward the coast, but through remaining where life has always been lived. Streets, homes, workshops, churches, and the harbour continue appearing much as they did before, yet every familiar place now carries the weight of adaptation. The great crowds have passed into history. Those who remained begin the slower work of carrying memory forward, one ordinary day at a time, beneath skies that have changed less than the lives unfolding beneath them. Quiet seasons of endurance. Summer settles over the coast almost reluctantly, arriving not through any single warm day but through the gradual accumulation of longer evenings, gentler winds, and fields whose green deepens beneath steady sunlight. The war has altered the lives of those living in Dunkirk, yet it has not persuaded the seasons to abandon their ancient order. Swallows continue tracing swift arcs above the rooftops. Gardens produce their careful harvests where soil and circumstance still allow. The sea reflects broad expanses of blue on calmer mornings, reminding anyone who pauses to look that nature seldom shares humanity's urgency. For the civilians who remained, time begins flowing differently once again. The dramatic uncertainty that accompanied the retreat has given way to something quieter and, in many ways, more demanding. Extraordinary events become less frequent than ordinary ones. Washing must still be hung before rain arrives. Roofs still require repairs after strong coastal winds. Children continue outgrowing shoes regardless of shortages. Illness follows its own calendar. Birthdays arrive quietly. Small anniversaries are remembered around kitchen tables where conversations now linger more often upon family than upon distant headlines. The streets gradually recover something resembling their older rhythm, though never entirely. Bicycles once again become the most common form of movement through the narrow lanes connecting neighborhoods to the harbor and markets. The pace is unhurried. People leave home carrying baskets, tools, or small parcels tucked beneath their arms, greeting familiar faces with restrained warmth before continuing toward whatever work the day requires. Yet beneath this appearance of normality lies an awareness shared by nearly everyone. Life has resumed, but it has not returned. Those are two different conditions, separated by experiences that cannot simply be forgotten because daily routines have reappeared. The harbor remains the clearest expression of this quiet contradiction. Fishing boats continue departing before sunrise whenever weather and regulations permit. Their crews still judge the wind by the feel of it against weathered skin, still read the changing surface of the water with instincts refined across decades at sea. Returning vessels unload modest catches that are handled with particular care. Nothing is wasted now. Every fish cleaned upon the quay represents food that cannot easily be replaced. The familiar labor of the waterfront survives, but its relationship with abundance has become noticeably more cautious. You notice how repair has become one of the defining occupations of the town. Carpenters spend long hours restoring shutters warped by salt air and neglect. Shoemakers replace soles so worn that, in earlier years, many would simply have purchased new footwear. Seamstresses turn collars, reinforce elbows, and carefully reshape children's clothing so that younger brothers and sisters may wear garments already outgrown by the oldest. The work itself is not new. What has changed is its importance. Repair is no longer merely economical. It has become an expression of respect for everything that continues serving despite hardship. Along the canals, life proceeds with the patient rhythm that has always characterized inland waterways. Barges move quietly through locks whose mechanisms still function with reassuring precision. Water reflects passing clouds exactly as it did before the retreat, before the occupation, before history attached new meanings to the name of the town itself. Lock keepers continue opening heavy gates, recording movements in neat handwriting, exchanging brief greetings with familiar boatmen whose journeys remain measured in careful miles rather than dramatic headlines. Their routines offer a subtle reminder that continuity often survives through occupations requiring steadfast attention more than public recognition. The beaches, too, begin resembling themselves once more, though never entirely. Wind smooths the sand each morning before the first footprints appear. Children cautiously return to collecting shells and polished stones, occasionally pausing where adults cannot help remembering the crowded shoreline of earlier months. Driftwood still washes ashore after storms. Gulls still argue noisily above the tide line. The landscape itself has recovered with remarkable speed, but memory lingers more stubbornly than footprints. Every familiar view now carries two images at once, the peaceful coastline before the eye, and another preserved quietly within the minds of those who watched the sea under very different circumstances. As evening draws slowly across Dunkirk, golden light settles upon brick walls that have witnessed both ordinary family life and extraordinary history within the same passing season. Windows open to welcome the cooler air drifting inland from the channel. Somewhere a violin can be heard faintly through an upstairs window before the sound is carried away by the breeze. A fisherman pauses at the harbour wall, studying tomorrow's weather with the same thoughtful expression his father might once have worn. The town continues living not because its difficulties have disappeared, but because life itself possesses a remarkable habit of seeking rhythm even after the greatest interruptions. Endurance, it turns out, is rarely loud. More often, it resembles another quiet evening beside the sea, where familiar tasks continue beneath an unchanged sky while those who remain slowly learn how to carry both memory and tomorrow together. The passing weeks teach the town that endurance is not measured only by surviving extraordinary moments, but by preserving ordinary ones. Dawn continues arriving over the rooftops with quiet reliability, touching chimney pots and church spires before gradually reaching the narrow streets below. The first sounds belong once again to familiar occupations. A baker slides loaves into the oven while the fire is still gathering strength. A milk cart rattles gently over worn cobblestones. Somewhere a carpenter opens the shutters of his workshop before placing carefully sharpened tools upon a bench polished smooth by many years of work. These routines do not erase what has happened. They simply insist that life must continue alongside memory rather than after it. Gardens become unexpectedly important during this quieter season. Small plots behind brick houses, once tended mainly for pleasure or modest household use, now receive careful daily attention. Beans climb simple wooden frames. Potatoes are planted wherever the soil allows. Herbs grow beside kitchen doors where they can be gathered easily before preparing the evening meal. Children carry watering cans almost as large as themselves, spilling as much water onto their shoes as onto the plants, while older relatives quietly smile before correcting their aim with patient hands. The harvests are rarely abundant, but they provide something beyond nourishment. They offer evidence that care invested today may still bear fruit tomorrow. The market continues serving as the quiet heart of the community. Familiar merchants greet returning customers by name, often remembering not only their usual purchases but also the small concerns shared during previous visits. A fishmonger asks after an elderly parent's health. A greengrocer quietly sets aside a handful of better vegetables for a family known to be caring for young children. These gestures are neither dramatic nor unusual. They reflect relationships built over many years, strengthened rather than diminished by recent hardship. Communities often reveal their greatest resilience not through grand collective acts, but through countless modest kindnesses repeated until they become almost invisible. You begin to understand that memory itself settles unevenly across the town. Certain places seem incapable of being viewed without recalling the months that changed them. A particular stretch of beach where crowds once waited now appears peaceful beneath the afternoon sun, yet older residents cannot cross it without remembering the thousands who had once looked across the same water. A warehouse near the harbor resumes its commercial purpose, but those who worked there still recall days when its contents and responsibilities had been entirely different. Memory does not prevent these places from returning to ordinary use. Instead, it quietly accompanies every familiar task, becoming another layer within the landscape rather than replacing it. The harbor remains faithful to its patient discipline. Nets are repaired beneath open skies where gulls continue circling in hopeful expectation. Boats are painted, engines serviced, and ropes replaced before they fail. Young apprentices learn their trades from older craftsmen whose lessons still begin with tides, weather, and careful workmanship rather than with the extraordinary events through which they have recently lived. Experience is passed from one generation to another in the same practical manner it always has been. Yet beneath every instruction lies an unspoken understanding that knowledge-preserving ordinary life has become more valuable than ever. The churches continue marking the passage of time through bells that drift gently across the rooftops each morning and evening. Weddings, though smaller than before, once again gather families beneath familiar arches. Children are baptized. Funerals continue honoring lives that have reached their natural conclusion rather than those interrupted suddenly by conflict alone. These ceremonies remind the town that human existence contains many rhythms beyond war. Birth, work, celebration, sorrow, and remembrance continue following one another as they always have, quietly reclaiming space within lives that had recently seemed dominated by uncertainty. As autumn begins announcing itself through cooler mornings and the first leaves turning along tree-lined streets, the light changes once more. Shadows lengthen earlier across the harbor. The sea adopts deeper shades of gray and blue beneath skies carrying the promise of stronger winds ahead. Fishermen prepare boats for another season of more difficult weather with the same patient care they have always shown. The changing season feels reassuring precisely because it remains predictable. Nature asks only that people adapt, something the residents of Dunkirk now understand more deeply than they ever expected to. Standing upon the harbor wall at the close of another ordinary day, you watch the tide rising quietly against stones worn smooth by generations before this one. Boats lift gently upon the water, their reflections stretching and shortening with each passing ripple. Around you, the town continues its patient work of living. Children laugh in distant streets. Smoke rises from evening fires. The smell of fresh bread drifts briefly across the cooling air before disappearing toward the sea. History has left its mark here, but it has not claimed everything. The people who remained have discovered that the truest form of endurance often lies not in extraordinary courage, but in the quiet determination to keep setting the table, repairing the boat, tending the garden, and opening the front door each morning to another day beside the channel. Today, if you stand upon the beaches of Dunkirk during the quiet hours of early morning, the first thing you are likely to notice is not history, but the sea. The tide still arrives with the same measured patience that shaped these shores long before the 20th century. Gentle waves smooth the sand where thousands of footsteps once gathered in anxious expectation. Gulls continue drifting on the wind above the harbor, their calls carried inland across rooftops that have watched generations come and go. Fishing boats leave before sunrise when the weather allows, returning with catches that remain subject to the same tides and changing skies that govern the lives of their grandparents. The landscape has recovered so completely that it almost seems reluctant to reveal how much it once witnessed. Yet places remember in ways that stone and water rarely announce. A familiar street may appear unchanged until someone quietly recalls who once stood waiting there. A section of harbor wall may seem no different from any other until an older photograph reveals crowds gathered where only a handful of visitors now pause to watch the tide. The dunes continue shifting beneath the wind, but memory settles differently. It moves not with the sand, but with the people who carry stories forward, allowing ordinary places to hold extraordinary meanings without altering their outward appearance. History remembers Dunkirk largely through ships, soldiers, and one of the most remarkable evacuations ever attempted. Those memories deserve their place. But alongside them lived another story. It belonged to the families who watched unfamiliar faces pass beneath their windows until the strangers became temporary neighbors. It belonged to bakers who measured flour more carefully each morning, to fishermen who continued reading tides while the world around them changed, to children who learned new games with companions whose journeys had begun far away, and to households that quietly unfolded another blanket each evening because someone else needed a place to sleep. They did not command armies. They did not plan operations. Many left behind no memoirs at all. Yet they remained where history happened. The work they performed was rarely dramatic enough to enter official reports. Bread was baked before dawn. Floors were swept. Nets were repaired. Gardens were tended. Boots were mended rather than replaced. Windows were opened each morning to admit the salt air, even when uncertainty had become as familiar as the weather itself. Their contribution was not measured in victories or defeats. It was measured in continuity, in the quiet refusal to allow ordinary human decency to disappear beneath extraordinary circumstances. Perhaps that is why coastal towns possess such a particular relationship with memory. The sea teaches patience better than almost any teacher can. Every tide advances. Every tide retreats. Nothing remains exactly as it was, yet nothing is entirely lost either. The water carries away footprints while preserving coastlines. It erases the evidence of individual days without erasing the generations who lived beside it. Human memory often works in much the same way. The smallest gestures fade first, until someone pauses long enough to notice that they formed the true foundation beneath every larger event. When we remember Dunkirk only through evacuation, we remember an extraordinary achievement. When we also remember those who stayed, we remember something equally enduring. We remember a community that quietly adapted while roads filled with strangers, while homes welcomed unfamiliar voices, while streets gradually changed their purpose, and while the sea became the final horizon for thousands of anxious eyes. We remember that history is never experienced solely by those whose names appear in official accounts. It is also carried by the people who continue preparing breakfast, repairing doors, tending children, and keeping neighborhoods alive while the world seems determined to change around them. Now the evening light begins settling once more across the channel. The harbor grows quieter as fishing boats return. The rooftops catch the final warmth of the setting sun before shadows gradually gather between the narrow streets. The tide rises gently against the old harbor stones, just as it did before the war, during those anxious weeks, and through every peaceful year that has followed since. The sea offers no speeches, only rhythm, only return, only the quiet reminder that even after history has passed through a place, life continues, arriving one ordinary morning at a time. Thank you for spending these quiet hours with echoes of war. Until our next journey into the quieter corners of history, may the wind remain gentle, may the water carry your thoughts peacefully onward, and may the voices of those who endured without recognition never be entirely lost beneath the waves. You've been part of Echoes of War, where stories rise on quiet wings, and the past still circles above us, refusing to land.